The dining room had gone so quiet that the tick of the grandfather clock in the hallway sounded like something falling. Marcus Coleman stood at the head of the long mahogany table, a small velvet box open in his palm, and watched the last 20 years of his life narrow down to the space between one breath and the next. Walter Ashford had not raised his voice. He had simply set down his wine glass with the particular precision of a man who wanted the sound of crystal touching wood to say what he had decided not to say out loud. "My daughter will not be marrying a man who fixes other people's roofs for a living," he said, and the room absorbed the sentence the way a held breath absorbs silence. Danielle's hand found Marcus's arm. His daughter Maya, 7 years old and wearing her good dress, the one with the small embroidered flowers along the hem, looked up at her father with an expression that had no fear in it yet, only confusion, the particular confusion of a child watching adults behave in ways she had not been taught to expect from people at a dinner table. Marcus did not close the box. He did not raise his voice either. He simply turned it slightly so the light from the chandelier caught the ring inside it, an old ring, gold gone soft with age, a small dark stone set in a pattern nobody at that table had seen in decades, and across from him, an elderly woman who had said almost nothing all evening set down her fork with a hand that had begun, very slightly, to shake. If you've ever had someone look at you and decide, before you said a word, exactly who you weren't allowed to become, this story is for you. Stay with us, because what happened at that table before dessert was served would rewrite everything Walter Ashford believed about his own family's history. Marcus Coleman had a system for Saturday mornings, and it had not changed in the 3 years since Renee died. He was up by 6, not because an alarm told him to be, but because his body had learned the rhythm of a working man's week and had never unlearned it. He made coffee, strong and black, and drank the first cup standing at the kitchen window looking out at the small backyard where he had built Maya a swing set the summer she turned 5, working through 2 weekends by himself because he wanted his hands to be the ones that made it. By 7, Maya was awake, and the house filled with the particular chaos of a 7-year-old getting dressed for the day, one sock always missing, hair that refused to cooperate, a running narration of whatever story she had been building in her head overnight. He made her breakfast, oatmeal with too much cinnamon because that was how she liked it, and packed her bag if it was a school day, checking twice that her library book was inside because she had cried the one time she forgot it. A small, private catastrophe that had taught him to check twice on everything that mattered to her. He drove her to her grandmother's if it wasn't a school day, so he could get to the job site by 8. And the drive itself had become its own small ritual. The same 3 songs on repeat, the same argument about whether the windows should be up or down. It was not a glamorous life, but it was a steady one. And Marcus had learned, in the hardest year of his life, the year after Renee's diagnosis and the 11 months that followed it, that steady was worth more than almost anything else a person could offer a child. He had built his company slowly, one job at a time, learning early that reputation in his line of work was not built on advertising or charm, but on the quiet, cumulative evidence of work done right and promises kept, and he had carried that lesson into fatherhood without ever quite realizing he was doing it, showing up early, staying late, never once letting Maya wonder whether he would be there. He ran a small contracting company, 4 men and a truck with his name stenciled on the door, Coleman Restoration and Repair, and he had built it slowly over 12 years from nothing but a set of tools that had belonged to his father and a reputation he had earned one finished job at a time. He specialized in restoration work, old houses, historic buildings, the kind of craftsmanship that required a person to understand not just how something was built, but why it had been built that way, what the hands that made it 100 years ago had been trying to say. He could stand in front of a 100-year-old staircase and read it the way another man might read a letter, understanding from the wear on the risers which side had been used most, from the joinery which era it belonged to, from the choice of wood what the original builder had been able to afford and what he had chosen to spend extra on anyway, because some things mattered enough to spend extra on even when money was tight. His crew liked to say that Marcus didn't fix old houses. He had conversations with them, and there was more truth in that joke than any of them fully understood. He had calluses that told the story of every year of it. a scar along his left forearm from a table saw incident in his 20s that he never explained unless asked twice, and a habit of running his thumb along the inside of his ring finger, an old ring he wore on a chain around his neck rather than his hand, because it had not been sized to fit him and he had never had it altered, and because some part of him had never quite felt ready to wear it the way it was meant to be worn. It had belonged to his great-grandfather. It was, along with a small collection of photographs and a single leather-bound ledger, almost everything Marcus had left of a family history nobody outside his own household had ever asked him to explain, mostly because nobody outside his own household had ever thought to ask. He had met Danielle Ashford 18 months earlier on a restoration job, ironically enough, at a boutique hotel her family's company had recently acquired, a beautiful old building with plaster molding that needed careful hands and a client who understood the difference between restoration and renovation. He remembered the first thing she'd said to him wasn't a greeting at all, but a question about whether the crown molding in the lobby was original, asked with the kind of specificity that told him immediately she'd actually looked, not glanced. She had come by the site to check on progress, wearing a blazer that cost more than his truck payment, and had stayed for 2 hours asking him questions about load-bearing walls and original craftsmanship with a genuine curiosity that had nothing performative in it. She had not been trying to impress him, she had simply been interested, the way some people are interested in things regardless of who happens to be explaining them. Marcus had noticed that about her before he noticed almost anything else. She listened the way his mother used to say a person's character shows itself, in what they pay attention to when nobody's grading them on it. What had followed was not fast. Marcus had been careful in a way he understood. Looking back was partly grief and partly caution. A man rebuilding trust in the world one small test at a time. Danielle had never once seemed to notice she was being tested, or if she had noticed, she had never made him feel foolish for it. She had met Maya slowly, deliberately, at Marcus's insistence, careful never to let the child feel like an afterthought or a hurdle to clear, and somewhere in the second month Maya had stopped calling her Miss Danielle and started simply calling her Danielle, a small linguistic shift that Marcus had noticed the way a man notices a shift in weather, quietly and with the sense that something important had just changed. Danielle had 2 brothers who worked in the family real estate business, and a father, Walter Ashford, who had built Ashford Properties from a single commercial building into one of the largest privately held real estate portfolios in the state. Walter was 71, silver-haired, precise in the way that men become when they have spent 50 years believing their judgment was rarely wrong, and he had opinions about almost everything, including, as it turned out, the man his daughter had chosen to love. Marcus had met him 3 times before the dinner where he asked for Danielle's hand, and each time Walter had been polite in the specific, controlled way of a man extending courtesy without extending warmth, the way a person might be polite to a contractor bidding on a job, which, Marcus understood, was more or less exactly how Walter saw him. Once, at a family barbecue, Marcus had overheard Walter introducing him to a business associate not as Danielle's boyfriend, but as the young man doing some work on the 5th Street property, and Marcus had said nothing, had simply filed it away the way he filed away everything, quietly, without letting it change his face. Maya, for her part, adored Danielle without complication. The uncomplicated love of a child who had watched her father grieve for 2 years and had slowly, carefully, allowed herself to hope that the house might have laughter in it again. She called Danielle by her first name and had, without being asked, started drawing pictures of the 3 of them together, stick figures holding hands in front of a house with a swing set, pictures Marcus kept in a drawer in his workshop because he did not trust himself to look at them too often without something in his chest coming loose. The dinner had been Danielle's idea, a formal announcement to her family before the wedding date was set publicly, and Marcus had understood. Walking into the Ashford house that evening with Maya's hand in his and the small velvet box in his jacket pocket, that he was walking into a room that had already, in some fundamental way, decided what it thought of him before he opened his mouth. The Ashford house sat on 4 acres behind a stone wall and an iron gate that opened automatically as the car approached. The kind of gate designed less for security than for the particular psychological effect of watching something part specifically for you. The driveway curved past a fountain that was not running that evening, past a row of trees so precisely maintained they looked less like living things and more like an idea of trees, and ended at a house that Marcus, with his professional eye, recognized immediately as older than the family that owned it, restored at some point by people who understood what they were doing, the kind of house that had been built to last centuries and had been maintained with exactly that intention. He noted, almost against his will, the quality of the stonework along the foundation, the way it had been repointed sometime in the last decade by someone who cared enough to match the original mortar color, and felt the small, involuntary respect a craftsman feels for good work regardless of who happens to own the building it's holding up. Inside, the floors were the original wide plank oak, polished to a shine that took real labor to maintain, and Marcus found himself doing the thing he always did in old houses without meaning to, cataloging the craftsmanship, noting the crown molding, the hand-carved banister, the fireplace surround that had almost certainly been imported. He kept it to himself. Maya beside him had gone quiet in the particular way children go quiet in spaces designed to make adults feel small, gripping his hand a little tighter, looking up at the high ceilings with an expression somewhere between wonder and unease. Marcus squeezed her hand once, a small signal they had developed together, and felt her fingers relax slightly against his palm. Danielle met them at the door, and something in Marcus's chest loosened at the sight of her the way it always did. The small private relief of seeing a familiar face in an unfamiliar room. She had told him her father would be reserved but fair. She had told him her mother had passed years earlier, and that the only other family present tonight would be her grandmother, Eleanor, who lived in the guest house on the property and rarely came to the main house for dinner anymore, but had insisted on being there tonight. Danielle had said this with a small, hopeful smile, as though her grandmother's presence was a good sign, and Marcus, not knowing the woman, had taken her word for it. The dinner began the way these dinners always began, with the particular choreography of people being polite to each other while measuring the distance between what they were saying and what they actually believed. There was a soup course, delicate and unfamiliar, and Marcus watched Maya study the small spoon set beside her larger one with a moment of confusion before quietly, without asking, following whatever spoon Danielle picked up first, a small adaptation that broke something tender loose in Marcus's chest even as he kept his face composed. Walter asked Marcus about his business with the tone of a man conducting due diligence rather than making conversation, questions about revenue and growth projections that had nothing to do with genuine curiosity and everything to do with cataloging a number he had already decided was too small, and Marcus answered honestly, plainly, the way he answered everything, describing the company he had built without embellishment and without apology. He watched Walter's face while he spoke and understood, with the particular clarity a person develops after years of walking into rooms where he had to read what wasn't being said, that the answers were not landing the way facts usually land. They were landing as confirmation of something Walter had already decided. Eleanor, the grandmother, said very little through the first two courses, but Marcus noticed her watching him with an attention that felt different from her son's, less like assessment and more like something closer to recognition, though he could not have said recognition of what. She was in her late 80s, sharp-eyed, dressed with the careful elegance of a woman who had spent a lifetime being underestimated by people who mistook age for diminishment, and twice during dinner Marcus caught her gaze lingering not on his face but on the outline of the chain at his collar, the small shape of the ring hanging beneath his shirt, visible only as a slight irregularity in the fabric. Once when he reached for his water glass the chain shifted, and he saw her eyes track the movement with an intensity that seemed, for a moment, entirely out of proportion to the small gesture that caused it. He did not think much of it at the time. There was a great deal about that evening he did not yet understand. The moment Marcus had planned for, the reason for the evening, arrived after the plates had been cleared and before dessert, when Danielle squeezed his hand under the table in a signal they had agreed on, and Marcus stood, feeling the particular vertigo of a man about to say something he had rehearsed 100 times in the mirror of his own bathroom, and had never managed to make sound less enormous. Maya, sensing the shift in the room, went still beside her father's empty chair, watching him with the seriousness of a child who understood that something important was happening even if she couldn't have named what. "Mr. Ashford," Marcus said, "I'd like to ask for your blessing to marry your daughter." He had reached into his jacket pocket as he spoke, and he set the small velvet box on the table, unopened, his hand resting beside it, steady despite everything happening beneath his ribs. "I love her. I intend to spend the rest of my life making sure she knows it every day. I wanted to ask you directly, in front of your family, because I think that matters." Walter Ashford let the silence stretch long enough that it became its own kind of answer before he ever spoke. He looked at the box on the table, then at Marcus, then, briefly, at his daughter, with an expression that Marcus recognized immediately as the specific look of a man rearranging his face to say something he had already decided to say regardless of what preceded it. "I appreciate the gesture," Walter said, and the word gesture did a great deal of quiet work in that sentence. "But I think we should be honest with each other, since you've chosen to make this a family occasion. Danielle has a certain life ahead of her. Obligations, expectations, a family name that carries weight in this city. I don't say this to be unkind, but you run a repair business. You fix roofs and gutters for people like us. That's honest work and I respect it, but it isn't the kind of foundation this family builds a future on." Danielle's face went pale, then flushed with something closer to fury. "Dad," she started, but Walter lifted a hand, not sharply, just with the absolute confidence of a man unaccustomed to being interrupted at his own table. "Let me finish," he said. He turned back to Marcus. "My daughter will not be marrying a man who fixes other people's roofs for a living. I say that with respect for the work itself and none whatsoever for the presumption of bringing a $500 ring to my table and treating it as though it settles the matter." Walter had not looked at the box closely. He said the words the way a man says something he assumes to be true without the burden of checking. "Whatever's in that box, Mr. Coleman, it doesn't change the math of this family's future." The room went quiet in the particular way rooms go quiet when someone has said the thing that had been sitting beneath the conversation the entire evening. Finally given shape and weight, Maya's small hand found the edge of the tablecloth and gripped it, her eyes moving between her father's face and the man across the table with an expression that was starting, for the first time that night, to edge toward fear. Marcus felt something in his chest go very still. Not anger exactly. Something older and quieter than anger, the particular stillness his own father had described to him once, a long time ago, as the feeling of being looked at and not seen. He did not raise his voice. He did not sit down. He simply reached forward and opened the box. The ring inside was not the kind of ring anyone at that table had expected, and the silence that followed its appearance was different in texture from the silence that had come before it, quieter and somehow more alert. It was old, unmistakably old, gold that had gone soft and warm with a century of handling, the band worn thin in places by decades of a hand that had worn it daily, and set into it a small dark stone, not a diamond. Something else, something with a depth to its color that caught the chandelier light and held it. Around the setting, barely visible unless a person leaned close, ran a thin engraved pattern, a series of interlocking initials worked into the metal with the kind of craftsmanship that belonged to a much older era of jewelry making, the sort of detail work that could not be rushed and could not be faked, the product of hands that had spent a lifetime learning exactly how much pressure a chisel needed and no more. "This isn't for Danielle," Marcus said quietly. "Not yet. I wanted you to see it first because it belonged to my great-grandfather, and it's the only thing of real value my family has ever managed to hold on to across 4 generations. I'm not asking you to be impressed by it. I'm asking you to understand that when I say I'll build a life for your daughter, I'm not asking you to trust a stranger. I come from people who built things too. We just never got the credit for it." Walter's expression carried the particular condescension of a man being told something he had already decided not to believe. "That's a lovely sentiment," he said, "but sentiment doesn't—" He stopped. Eleanor had risen from her chair. She had not spoken through the entire exchange, had sat through her son's dismissal with an unreadable stillness that Marcus had noticed but not understood, and now she stood, slowly, one hand braced against the table, and crossed the room toward him with the careful, deliberate steps of a woman for whom walking required real effort but who was not going to let that stop her. She stopped in front of Marcus and looked down at the ring in the open box with an expression that had gone somewhere far away from the dinner table, somewhere far away from that room entirely, her lips parting slightly around a breath that seemed to catch somewhere in her chest before she found her voice. "May I?" she said, and it was not really a question. Marcus lifted the box slightly, and Eleanor reached out with a hand that trembled, not from age this time, and touched the edge of the ring with one finger, tracing the engraved pattern along its band the way a person touches something they had once believed lost forever, something they had spent decades believing existed only in memory. "Where did you get this?" she said. Her voice had changed entirely, the polite social register she had used all evening replaced by something rawer, something with real weight behind it. Something that made even Walter, at the head of the table, sit forward slightly. "It's been in my family for 4 generations, Marcus said. "It belonged to my great-grandfather, Elijah Coleman. He was an iron worker. Structural steel, mostly, and ornamental metalwork on the side. He built half the buildings in the old commercial district before anyone thought to write his name down anywhere that mattered." Eleanor did not look up from the ring. "Elijah Coleman," she repeated, very quietly, as though testing the shape of the name in her mouth after a very long time of not saying it, the syllables coming slowly, deliberately, like something being lifted carefully out of deep water. Walter had gone still at the head of the table. "Mother," he said, "what is this?" Eleanor finally looked up, and when she spoke, she was not speaking to Marcus, not really. She was speaking to her son, and there was something in her voice that made even the walls of that overly ordered dining room feel suddenly less certain of themselves. "This company, Walter," she said, "this family. Everything your father built, everything you built on top of it. It started with a man named Elijah Coleman." The room did not go quiet the way it had gone quiet during Walter's rejection, the tense, held breath quiet of a public wound. This was a different silence. The silence of a room realizing it did not understand something it had assumed it fully understood for a very long time. Marcus stood very still, the box still in his hand, and watched an old woman's memory begin to surface something that had apparently been buried for the better part of a century. Eleanor sat down slowly, not in her original chair but in the one beside Marcus, and asked, with a directness that startled everyone at the table, including herself, to see the ledger. When Marcus told her he had one, a small leather-bound book of his great-grandfather's, records and sketches passed down through the family, Eleanor closed her eyes for a moment and said, very simply, "Then you need to bring it here, tonight, if it isn't too much trouble. I think my son needs to see it more than he realizes." What followed, over the next 2 hours, was not the confrontation Marcus had braced himself for walking through that iron gate. It was something stranger, and in its own way harder to sit through. Eleanor told the story slowly, with the particular care of someone assembling pieces she had never before had reason to put in order out loud, her hands folded in her lap, her eyes fixed on some middle distance that belonged more to 1958 than to the room she was sitting in. Walter's father, Charles Ashford, had started the family business in the 1950s as a modest general contracting operation, and the building that had made his early reputation, the one that had won him his first major commercial contract, had been built with structural ironwork designed and fabricated by a small crew led by a man named Elijah Coleman, a black ironworker whose craftsmanship, according to the surviving records, was extraordinary, and whose name, according to every official document from that project onward, did not appear anywhere. Charles Ashford had taken the design credit for the ornamental steelwork that made the building distinctive, had used photographs of that steelwork in every piece of marketing material the company produced for the next decade, and had never once, in any public account of his own success, mentioned the man who actually designed and forged it. Eleanor had known this, or known pieces of it, for most of her adult life, married into a family whose foundational myth she had slowly come to understand was incomplete in a way that made her deeply uncomfortable, and that she had never found the right moment, or the right courage, to address directly. There had been a company Christmas party in the early 60s, she said, where a much younger version of herself had asked her husband directly who had actually done the ironwork on the Fifth Street building, and Charles had waved the question away with the easy irritation of a man who did not like being asked to account for things he preferred left unexamined, and she had let it go, the way women of her generation had so often been trained to let things go, and had spent decades quietly regretting that she had. She had met Elijah Coleman exactly once, decades earlier, at an anniversary event where he had come, uninvited by the family but present as a guest of another contractor, and Charles Ashford had introduced him to the room as one of the men who worked on the original building, a phrase that had made something in Eleanor's stomach turn even then, watching a man whose actual design work built her husband's fortune reduced to the passive geography of one of the men. She remembered, she said, the particular dignity with which he had accepted that erasure in public, and the particular quiet with which he had corrected it, briefly, only to her, in a conversation near the coat check that had lasted less than 2 minutes and that she had thought about, on and off, for the rest of her life. Elijah Coleman had died in 1974, largely uncredited for a body of work that still stood in the city's commercial district, and his family, Marcus's family, had carried the knowledge of what had happened forward through 2 more generations with a mixture of quiet pride and quiet grief, the ledger and the ring the only physical proof that remained of a legacy the official record had erased. Walter Ashford sat through his mother's account with his hands flat on the table, his face moving through several expressions that Marcus, watching him, recognized as the specific unraveling of a man whose understanding of his own family, and by extension himself, had just been fundamentally restructured in front of witnesses. He did not interrupt his mother. He did not, for a long time, say anything at all. When Marcus retrieved the ledger from his truck and brought it back to the table, Walter looked through it slowly, page after page of sketches and measurements and material lists in a careful, precise hand, structural drawings that Marcus, without needing to explain it, could see Walter recognizing, page by page, as matching photographs he had grown up seeing in his own father's office. Near the back of the ledger, tucked between pages, was a single black and white photograph, worn soft at the edges, of a young black man standing in front of a half-finished building, his hand resting on a section of ornamental ironwork, wearing an expression of quiet, unperformed pride. Walter stared at that photograph for a long time, his thumb moving once, absently, across the worn corner of it, the same unconscious gesture Marcus made 100 times a day against the ring on its chain. "I grew up looking at that building," he said finally. His voice smaller than Marcus had heard it all evening. "My father used to take me to see it. He told me he designed that steelwork himself." "He didn't," Eleanor said, not unkindly, but without softening it either. "And I think some part of you may have known that for a long time, Walter. I think some part of all of us did." Maya, who had been sitting quietly through the last hour with the particular patience children develop when they sense they're witnessing something they aren't yet meant to fully understand, tugged gently on Marcus's sleeve. "Daddy," she whispered, "is that your grandpa in the picture?" "Great-great-grandpa," Marcus said quietly, crouching slightly to her level, one hand steady on her small shoulder. "That's the man who made the ring." Maya looked at the photograph, then up at Walter, with the open, uncomplicated directness only children manage to sustain in rooms full of adults working hard to hold themselves together. "Did you know his name before tonight?" she asked. Walter looked at her for a long moment, something in his face softening at the plainness of the question in a way it had not softened for anything an adult had said all evening. "No," he said. "I didn't, and I should have." Danielle, who had said almost nothing since her father's initial rejection, reached across the table and took her grandmother's hand, then looked at her father with an expression that held both old hurt and something gentler underneath it. "Dad," she said quietly, "this changes things, doesn't it?" Walter did not answer immediately. He closed the ledger carefully, the way a man closes something he understands he has no right to handle carelessly, and looked at Marcus for a long moment, the calculation and reflexive judgment that had defined every previous conversation between them entirely absent from his face for the first time that evening. "I owe you an apology," Walter said, "and I understand that an apology tonight doesn't undo what my family did to yours, or what I did to you an hour ago at this table, deciding who you were before I let you finish a sentence." He paused, and something in his jaw tightened. The specific effort of a proud man saying something that cost him. I looked at you and saw a man who fixes roofs. I didn't see a man whose family built the foundation this company still stands on. That's not a small mistake. That's the same mistake my father made. And I made it without even knowing I was making it, which somehow feels worse. Marcus did not gloat. He did not raise his voice or point out, though he could have, exactly how deep the wound went, how many decades of erased credit and quiet dignity had led to this particular table on this particular night. He simply said, quietly, my great-grandfather never got to hear anyone say his name in a room like this. I think that matters more to me than an apology does. If there's a way to put his name back where it belongs, on that building, in whatever records still exist, that's what I'd want from tonight. Not for me, for him. Walter nodded slowly. That can be done, he said. It should have been done a long time ago. Eleanor reached over and closed her hand gently over Marcus's, the same hand that had opened the small velvet box an hour earlier. Whatever my son decides about roofs and foundations, she said, with the faint, dry humor of a very old woman who had earned the right to say difficult things lightly, you have my blessing. You had it the moment I saw that ring. Walter looked at his daughter, then at Marcus, then, for a long moment, at Maya, who was watching the whole exchange with the wide, serious eyes of a child cataloging every detail for later. Something in his face finally settled, the last of the evening's tension leaving it, replaced by something closer to humility than Marcus had thought the man capable of showing. You have my blessing too, he said. And Elijah Coleman's name is going back on that building's cornerstone before the year is out. That's not charity. That's a debt. 6 months later, on a bright afternoon in early autumn, a small crowd gathered outside the old commercial building in the city's historic district, the one whose ornamental steelwork had for 70 years carried another man's name. A new plaque had been installed beside the entrance, bronze, simple, listing Elijah Coleman as the structural designer and master ironworker responsible for the building's signature steelwork, alongside the name of the company that had built it. Marcus stood before it with Maya's hand in his, Danielle beside him wearing the ring that had finally properly been given to her, resized now to fit her hand exactly, and Eleanor seated in a folding chair brought specially for the occasion, watching with an expression of quiet, hard-won peace, a woman who had waited 60 years to see something set right and had lived long enough to watch it happen. Maya reached up and touched the edge of the bronze plaque with one small finger, tracing the letters of a name that belonged to her family, a man she had never met but whose steady hands, in some way she was only beginning to understand, had shaped the very ground she was standing on. Is this what you meant? She asked her father. When you said some things take a long time to get fixed right? Marcus looked down at his daughter, then at the plaque, then at the building rising above them, built on a foundation his family had shaped and had waited 3 generations to be credited for. Yeah, baby, he said. Sometimes the truth just needs someone patient enough to wait for the room to catch up to it. Some inheritances are written in gold and stone, passed down in boxes and ledgers, carried quietly across generations by people who never stopped believing their worth would eventually be seen. And some debts, no matter how long they're left unpaid, are never truly forgotten, only waiting for someone brave enough to open the box and let the truth catch the light. If this story stayed with you, share it with someone who needs to hear it. And if you haven't already, subscribe. There are more stories like this one waiting to be told.